I'll never forget that night. The moon was high and full, casting an eerie glow over the villa's manicured gardens. I had ventured outside for a stroll, hoping to clear my mind of the mounting tension ever since we'd arrived in France. The serenity of the night was disrupted only by the occasional rustle of leaves and the distant chirping of crickets. I was halfway down the gravel path when I saw him. A tall, shadowy figure loomed in the distance, just beyond the reach of the villa's warm lights. His presence seemed out of place against the picturesque backdrop. I couldn't make out his features, but his posture and the way he moved sent chills down my spine. Instinctively, I stepped back, my heart pounding as I squinted to get a better look. I took a deep breath, trying to calm myself. It's just a stranger, I thought. Maybe he's a local taking a late-night walk. But as he drew closer, I could see the outline of his face beneath the brim of his hat. His eyes were dark, and his expression was tense, almost desperate. I tried to turn and head back to the villa, but my legs felt glued to the ground. "Hey!" I called out, hoping to break the uneasy silence. My voice trembled, betraying my fear. "What are you doing here?" The figure stopped in his tracks, and there was only silence for a moment. Then he spoke, his voice low and harsh. "You shouldn't be here, not tonight." His words sent a shiver through me. I took another step backward, my mind racing. "Who are you?" I demanded, though I knew it was a pointless question. The way he spoke suggested he wasn't someone to be trifled with. "I'm not here to harm you," he said, though his tone made me doubt his words. "But if you know what's good for you, you'll stay inside. Don't try to follow me." Before I could respond, he turned and vanished into the darkness. I stood there, rooted to the spot, trying to understand what had happened. The fear I felt was almost palpable, wrapping around me like a cold fog. My heart raced as I hurried back to the villa, my mind replaying the encounter. As I fumbled with the door, my wife, Jennifer, looked up from where she sat in the living room. Her face was filled with concern. "Are you okay?" she asked, noticing the fear in my eyes. "There was someone outside," I said, my voice shaking. "A man. He seemed dangerous." Jennifer's expression turned to one of alarm. "What do you mean? Did he hurt you?" "No," I replied quickly, "but he said we should stay inside. I don't know what he meant, but it didn't feel right." We locked the doors and drew the curtains, but the sense of security was fleeting. The villa, which had seemed like a haven just days ago, now felt like a prison. The tranquility of the French countryside was replaced by a palpable tension that neither of us could shake. That night, sleep eluded us. Every creak of the house, every whisper of the wind felt like a potential threat. The man's warning echoed in my mind, a constant reminder that we were not alone or safe. When we first arrived at the villa in the French countryside, it felt like we had stepped into a dream. The grandeur of the estate, with its ivy-clad walls and sprawling gardens, was like something out of a storybook. My wife, Jennifer, and I had been looking forward to this vacation for months, and as we unpacked our bags, we felt a sense of excitement and relief wash over us. The villa was everything we had hoped for: a spacious living area with antique furnishings, a kitchen stocked with local delicacies, and a beautiful terrace overlooking the rolling hills. Every morning, we awoke to the soft chirping of birds and the fragrant scent of blooming flowers. The days passed in a blissful blur of sightseeing, leisurely meals, and sun-soaked afternoons by the pool. We spent our days exploring nearby villages, tasting exquisite French wines, and basking in the warmth of the summer sun. The nights were equally enchanting. We dined al fresco under a canopy of stars, savoring the cool evening breeze and the tranquility of our surroundings. For the first few days, everything was perfect. It was a slice of paradise. But then, as the days turned into a week, I noticed little things that felt off. It was nothing concrete at first, just a flicker of movement at the edge of my vision, or a distant, unfamiliar sound that seemed to echo through the villa's stone walls. Jennifer dismissed it as the quirks of an old house, attributing the noises to the settling of the building or the wind rustling through the trees. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. One evening, a chill ran down my spine as we enjoyed a quiet dinner on the terrace. I glanced around, catching sight of a shadow darting behind the trees. I mentioned it to Jennifer, but she reassured me that it was a trick of the light. As the days continued, the strange occurrences grew more frequent. The noises at night became louder and more distinct. We heard footsteps on the gravel paths and scratching sounds against the windows. Each night, I found myself lying awake, straining to listen to the sounds of the house. The shadows outside seemed to take on a more menacing shape, and I started to feel a creeping sense of paranoia. Our idyllic escape was starting to feel like a twisted version of reality, but I pushed my unease aside, hoping it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. After all, who would have guessed that our perfect French retreat would soon turn into a nightmare? The first few days in the villa were pure bliss. The sunlit mornings and starry nights were precisely what we needed to escape our hectic lives back in the States. But it wasn't long before things started to shift. It began with faint noises in the dead of night, scratches against the walls or the sound of something heavy being dragged. At first we brushed it off as the quirks of an old house. After all, the villa was centuries old, and we'd heard stories about creaky floorboards and settling foundations. But then there were the shadows. At first, they were fleeting, dark shapes moving past the windows as if someone was walking just outside. I'd wake up in the middle of the night and see them darting around, only to find nothing when I checked. Jen thought I was imagining things, but she couldn't deny the unease in our otherwise perfect vacation. One evening, we sat on the terrace, enjoying a glass of wine and the countryside view bathed in the golden light of dusk. I noticed the shadows outside were more pronounced, almost as if they were watching us. Jen asked if I was okay, and I could only manage a forced smile, brushing off her concern. It was the play of light and the unfamiliarity of the place. The real change came that night. I was restless and decided to walk around the villa's grounds, hoping the fresh air would clear my mind. The moon was full, casting an eerie glow over everything. The villa's gardens, which had seemed so inviting during the day, now appeared foreboding under the moonlight. As I walked along the gravel path, I noticed a figure standing near the edge of the property, half hidden in the shadows. At first, I thought it might be someone from the nearby village, but the figure's movements were erratic and unnatural. My heart began to race. I tried to ignore it, but the figure seemed to follow me, keeping pace with my steps. I quickened my pace, my breaths coming in sharp bursts. The figure did the same. When I reached a clearing, I turned around and saw him clearly for the first time, a tall man with a gaunt face, his eyes glinting with a predatory gleam. He stepped forward, and I could see that he was dressed in dark, worn clothing, as though he'd been hiding out here for some time. "Lost something?" he called out, a harsh whisper that sent shivers down my spine. I froze, unable to respond as fear gripped me. "Just a little late-night stroll," I managed to stammer, trying to sound casual, but my voice betrayed me with its tremor. The man's expression twisted into a menacing grin. "I don't think you should be out here," he said. "Not with what I have planned." Panic surged through me. I turned and ran back towards the villa, my heart pounding. Behind me, I could hear the man's footsteps quickening. I burst through the door, slamming it shut and locking it with shaking hands. I told Jen what had happened, and her face went pale as she realized the gravity of the situation. That night, we huddled in the bedroom, listening to the muffled sounds of the man's threats outside. Though distorted by the distance, his voice was clear enough to instill a paralyzing fear. We were trapped, every creak and groan of the villa heightening our sense of vulnerability. The perfect vacation had turned into a nightmare. The first few nights at the villa were everything we'd hoped for, quiet, serene, and picturesque. But as the days wore on, an unsettling sense of dread began to creep in. It started subtly, a soft thump in the dead of night, a shadow slipping past the window. At first I convinced myself it was just the quirks of an old house settling into the night, or perhaps the wind playing tricks on us. But then the noises grew louder. One night, around 2 a.m., a series of sharp, rhythmic knocks echoed through the villa. My wife, Jennifer, was already asleep, but I lay awake, heart pounding, trying to pinpoint the source. The sound came from the direction of the attic. I told myself it was just an old house creaking, but the rhythm was too deliberate to be random. The next night was even worse. I was awakened by the unmistakable sound of dragging footsteps, slow and deliberate, just outside our bedroom door. I lay still, my breath caught in my throat, listening as the footsteps moved away down the hall. I waited for hours before I dared to get up and check. The hall was empty, but the unsettling feeling remained. By the third night, the shadows had become more defined. I'd catch glimpses of them moving past the windows, fleeting shapes that seemed to flit just out of sight. Jennifer and I would sit together in the dim light of the living room, our voices hushed as we exchanged worried glances. We were both unnerved, but neither wanted to admit it. That night, we decided to try to get to the bottom of it. I suggested walking around the villa's grounds to see if we could spot anything unusual. Jennifer hesitated, but agreed, her anxiety evident. We walked silently, our flashlight casting long, eerie shadows on the villa's walls. Everything seemed calm, too calm, as if the house itself was holding its breath. We had just decided to head back inside when I heard it, a faint rustling sound coming from the direction of the garden. I turned to Jennifer, her face pale in the flashlight's beam, and gestured for her to stay put. I approached the source of the noise cautiously. The garden was bathed in an eerie, moonlit glow, and the rustling seemed to come from the tall hedges at the far end. As I was about to investigate further, a shadow detached itself from the darkness and loomed over me. It was the exact tall figure I'd seen before, standing just a few feet away. My heart skipped a beat as I recognized the intensity of his gaze. The man was not just a stranger, he was a wanted criminal, and his presence here was no coincidence. My first instinct was to run, but I froze, unable to tear my eyes away from his menacing form. The man's voice was low, almost a whisper, but it was filled with malice. He threatened us, his words dripping with hostility, making it clear that he was not just here to scare us. I turned and hurried back to Jennifer, the fear in my eyes reflecting the terror that had seized me. We hurried inside, locking every door and window as fast as possible. Our nerves were frayed, and the villa that had once seemed so charming now felt like a prison. We spent the rest of the night huddled together, listening to the man's threats echoing through the darkness, our hearts pounding in sync with the ominous sounds outside. As dawn approached, our terror began to subside, replaced by a tense anticipation. Would the nightmare end or continue until the sun fully rose? I hoped walking would clear my head and help me overcome the growing sense of unease. Around midnight, I decided to leave the villa, thinking the cool night air might bring some calm. Little did I know that this decision would lead me straight into the heart of our worst nightmare. The villa, with its sprawling grounds and ancient stone walls, looked even more imposing in the moonlight. I strolled, trying to listen for any sounds that might explain the strange disturbances we'd been hearing. The garden was eerily quiet, the usual chirping of crickets absent, leaving an oppressive silence that seemed to press in on me from all sides. I'd just passed the old fountain when I noticed him. At first, he was just a shadow against the stone wall, but the details became more apparent as I drew closer. He was tall, cloaked in dark clothing that blended into the night. A hood obscured his face, but the faint glint of moonlight off his eyes sent a shiver down my spine. I froze. My mind raced as I recognized something was wrong. He wasn't just any stranger. The local news had been broadcasting reports about a fugitive on the run, and this man's menacing presence made me realize that he was the one they'd been talking about. Suddenly, the man turned and looked directly at me. The hood fell back slightly, revealing a face he'd seen in a police sketch. It was him, Lucas Carter, the escaped criminal. My heart pounded in my chest, and I took an involuntary step back. He didn't seem surprised to see me. If anything, his gaze grew more intense. Out for a midnight stroll? His voice was low, chilling, and laced with a dangerous edge. I didn't expect to have company. I tried to keep my voice steady. You shouldn't be here. The police are looking for you. He chuckled, a cold, humorless sound that echoed in the still night. And do you think they'll come looking for me here? This place is too isolated. I'm not worried about them. Panic surged through me. What do you want? I demanded, though my voice trembled despite my efforts to sound firm. His smile widened, revealing a set of unnervingly sharp teeth. I want to make sure you understand that you're not safe. Not here, not anywhere. If you think you can call for help, think again. I'm watching you. The weight of his words settled heavily on my shoulders. I knew I needed to get back to the villa and warn Jennifer. I turned to leave, but he stepped into my path, blocking my way. You're not going anywhere, he said. If you try to alert the authorities, I'll make sure you regret it. You and your friend will be the first to know what it feels like to be afraid. My heart raced as I felt a surge of desperation. Please, just let me go. We won't bother you. He seemed to consider this momentarily, his gaze cold and calculating. I'm not a fool. I know you'll try something, so here's what will happen. You'll stay inside that villa and quiet. If you make a sound or try to contact anyone, you'll discover how serious I am. With that, he turned and melted into the shadows, leaving me paralyzed with fear. I stumbled back toward the villa, my thoughts racing as I grappled with the gravity of the situation. The chill of the night seemed to seep into my bones as I rushed through the garden and back to the villa. Every step felt like a mile. My mind was fixated on the threats and the certainty that we were in grave danger. I burst through the front door, finding Jennifer in the living room, her face pale and eyes wide with worry. "We have to lock everything down," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "He's out there. He knows we're here and he's threatening us. We're not safe." Jennifer's eyes widened in horror as she listened to my account. We scrambled to secure the windows and doors, our hands shaking with fear. As we huddled together in the dim light, the reality of the night's events settled over us like a suffocating shroud. We had to stay silent, stay hidden, and pray that the police would find him before it was too late. The night was thick with silence, punctuated only by the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. I had hoped that a walk might calm my nerves, but I became more profound in the grips of fear. Once a symbol of relaxation, the villa now felt like a prison. As I turned the corner of the stone pathway, I spotted him again, the tall figure whose face I could barely make out in the dim moonlight. My heart raced. It was the same man I'd seen earlier, and something about him told me he was in trouble. He emerged from the shadows, his silhouette menacing and deliberate. I stopped dead in my tracks, unsure whether to flee or confront him. He was closer now, and I could see the glint of something metallic in his hand, a knife. His cold and calculating eyes locked onto mine. I swallowed hard, trying to muster any semblance of courage. "Who are you?" I asked, my voice trembling despite my efforts to stay calm. "Who am I?" he echoed with a twisted smile. "I'm the one you should be afraid of." His accent was thick, but his words were clear, each dripping with menace. "I know you've seen me. I know you've heard things, but if you think you can run or hide, think again." A shiver ran down my spine as he took a step closer. I could see the determination in his eyes, a terrifying mix of anger and desperation. My mind raced, trying to devise an escape plan, but my legs felt rooted. "Please, just leave us alone," I pleaded, my voice barely above a whisper. "We're just vacationing here. We don't want any trouble." His smile widened, but it was far from reassuring. "Trouble? Oh, trouble is exactly what you're in. I've been watching you, waiting for the right moment." His gaze shifted to the villa, its warm lights contrasting with the cold night around us. "Your little vacation has turned into my playground." I backed away slowly, trying to keep him in sight while searching for any sign of help. The terror I felt was almost suffocating. The shadows seemed to press in around me, making it feel like there was no escape. "You think you can just walk away from this?" he said, his voice growing more ominous. "I know you're scared, and you should be, because as long as you're here, I'll be watching. And if you try anything, you'll find out just how dangerous I can be." I took another step back, my mind racing through possible scenarios. My phone, buried in my pocket, felt like a distant lifeline. I needed to get back to the villa and get help, but every movement felt like it might trigger his reaction. Before I could make another move, a faint sound reached my ears, a distant siren, growing louder by the second. His eyes widened briefly, a flicker of panic crossing his face. "Looks like your friends are calling for backup," he said, his voice tinged with frustration. "But don't think this is over. I'll be back, and next time you won't be so lucky." With that, he melted back into the shadows, disappearing as suddenly as he had appeared. I stood there, my heart pounding as the sirens grew closer. The relief was immediate, but tempered by the lingering fear of what might come next. The night was an eerie blend of silence and unsettling sounds. I'd expected to find solace in the villa's grand main bedroom, but even here, the oppressive sense of dread clung to me like a second skin. The walls that once seemed so charming and picturesque now felt like they were closing on us. Every creak of the floorboards and distant rustle of the trees outside seemed amplified in the darkness. Jenna and I huddled under the heavy duvet, trying to ignore the sound of our breathing, which seemed loud and intrusive in the dead of night. The cold sweat on my forehead was not from the chill in the air, but from the gnawing fear that kept me awake. Our earlier conversation about the stranger had become a whispered discussion about what we might do if he returned. It was a conversation we'd hoped would remain hypothetical, but now it felt like a grim reality we were helpless to escape. Around midnight, I thought I heard the faintest scraping sound against the window, and my heart leaped into my throat. I strained my ears, trying to differentiate between the wind and something more sinister. The shadows in the room seemed to dance, morphing into shapes that played tricks on my eyes. Every time I closed them, I saw the tall figure's piercing gaze, his menacing grin etched into my memory. Jenna sensed my distress by gently squeezing my hand, her fingers trembling. "Are you sure it's just the wind?" she whispered, her voice barely audible over the pounding of my heart. "I don't know," I replied, my voice cracking. "It's hard to tell. I couldn't take it anymore. My curiosity and fear compelled me to get up and investigate. I pulled on a jacket and quietly left the bedroom, moving stealthily through the darkened halls of the villa. The wooden floors creaked under my weight, each sound echoing like a drumbeat of impending doom. I approached the main living area and noticed the back door was slightly ajar. It was unusual. We had ensured it was locked before heading to bed. My breath hitched as I stepped outside into the cool night air, the mist rolling across the ground adding to the eerie atmosphere. There he was, standing just beyond the garden lights, his tall figure cloaked in shadows. The moonlight barely illuminated his face, but I could see enough to recognize the same piercing eyes from our earlier encounter. My stomach twisted into knots as he took a menacing step toward me. "You thought you could just ignore me?" His low, gravelly whisper sent shivers down my spine. "You're not safe here." Panic surged through me. I stumbled backward, my mind racing as I tried to think of a plan. "What do you want?" I managed to stammer, my voice trembling. "Just making sure you understand the gravity of the situation," he replied with a sinister smirk. "You and your little friend inside are lucky I'm not in the mood to do anything rash, but I'm watching." I wanted to run, but my legs felt like lead. I knew I had to get back inside and protect Jenna, but every step felt like an eternity. When I finally returned to the bedroom, I locked the door behind me and collapsed beside Jenna. The rest of the night was a blur of fear and exhaustion. We held each other, listening to the occasional rustle outside that seemed to signal his presence. Sleep was impossible, replaced by a constant state of hypervigilance. As dawn approached, the sounds outside finally stopped. The arrival of the morning light felt like a fragile hope, but it was tinged with the reality that our peaceful retreat had been shattered. We were left in a state of terror, knowing that the nightmare was only beginning. The first light of dawn crept through the heavy curtains, casting a pale glow on the room. I lay in bed, my heart still racing from the terror of the night before. The sounds of the criminal's threats were etched in my mind like a sinister lullaby, the fear keeping me from drifting off even for a moment. Jenny was curled beside me, her breaths shallow and rapid, mirroring my own. As the sun rose, the distant sound of sirens reached our ears. It was a faint, hopeful noise that seemed to cut through the thick fog of anxiety hanging over us. I barely dared to believe it was real, but the familiar wail grew more insistent. I nudged Jenny awake, whispering urgently, "Jenny, I think the police are here." She blinked sleepily, and then her eyes widened with the same realization that hit me. We both sprang out of bed, moving as quietly as possible, our fear mingling with a fragile thread of hope. We crept to the window and peered out, where we saw the flashing lights of police cars illuminating the driveway. The commotion outside was a chaotic mix of voices and footsteps. The police officers moved with practiced efficiency, their movements contrasting with the frantic, fearful energy that had dominated our night. I felt a surge of relief so intense it was almost overwhelming. It was as if a massive weight had been lifted from my shoulders. We waited anxiously by the window, watching as officers surrounded the property and began their search. The scenes from the night before replayed in my mind, but now a sense of order and control had been desperately absent. Each passing moment seemed to stretch into eternity as we hoped and prayed for a quick resolution. Minutes felt like hours, but eventually we saw the officers escorting the tall figure from the house, his hands cuffed behind his back. He cast a last hateful glance in our direction before being placed into the back of a police car. The sight of him finally being taken away brought an immense, almost cathartic relief. One of the officers approached us, his face lined with concern as he inquired about our well-being. We explained what had happened, our voices trembling as we recounted the harrowing details of the previous night. He assured us that the criminal was a dangerous fugitive and that we were safe now. As the police conducted their final checks and began leaving, the villa slowly returned to normalcy. The once ominous shadows seemed less menacing in the bright morning light, but the psychological scars remained. Jenny and I stood together, clinging to each other, the weight of the night's terror still fresh in our minds. The villa, which had promised a peaceful retreat, had become the setting for a nightmare. Despite the safety we now felt, the previous night's events would haunt us long after we left France. The memories of those hours of fear and uncertainty were imprinted on our hearts, a stark reminder of how quickly a dream vacation can turn into a waking nightmare. The sun was beginning to rise when the reality of our night finally started to sink in. The villa, a haven of tranquility just hours before, now felt like a prison. The weight of what had happened pressed heavily on my shoulders. I could see the exhaustion etched into Jennifer's face as she sat on the edge of the bed, her hands trembling slightly. The sight of her anxiety made me feel even more helpless. The police had arrived promptly, their authoritative presence a stark contrast to the sinister figure we had been cowering from all night. They conducted a thorough search of the grounds and swiftly apprehended the criminal. Seeing him handcuffed and led away in the early light was a slight relief, but the sense of security was hard to come by. The officers assured us that we were safe now, but their reassurances felt hollow compared to the dread we had experienced just hours before. I wandered through the villa, my mind replaying the night's events. Every creak of the floorboards and flicker of the shadows seemed to mock me, reminding me of the terror we had endured. The once charming rooms now felt cold and unwelcoming. I glanced out the windows frequently, half expecting to see the criminal's shadow lurking in the distance. Jennifer tried to console me, but her fear was palpable. She clung to my arm, and I could feel her heart racing even as she tried to put on a brave face. We talked in hushed tones, piecing together what had happened, trying to make sense of the chaos that had erupted so suddenly. Each revelation about the criminal's identity and motives added to the unsettling nature of the night. Our conversations turned to practical matters. We discussed whether we should stay or leave, and while the idea of packing up and fleeing was tempting, we decided it would be best to remain until we felt it was safe. The police had promised extra patrols around the villa for the foreseeable future, and we hoped that this measure would bring some sense of normalcy back to our shattered vacation. As the day wore on, we attempted to return to some semblance of normalcy. We made breakfast in a daze. The once joyful task was now tinged with an uncomfortable tension. The picturesque view from the villa's dining room felt distant, starkly contrasting the horror we had lived through. Jennifer and I exchanged glances, silently acknowledging that the idyllic getaway we had envisioned was now tainted by our night of fear. The whole experience had left an indelible mark on us. With its luxurious amenities and beautiful surroundings, the villa had been irrevocably transformed in our minds. It was no longer a retreat, but a place where our worst fears had come to life. The memory of the criminal's threats and the fear that had gripped us would linger long after we left. We knew that the trauma of the night would follow us, coloring our memories of what should have been a peaceful escape. We prepared to leave as evening approached, knowing the villa would never feel like a sanctuary again. We packed our belongings with a sense of finality, trying to leave behind the fear that had haunted us. We were grateful for our safety, but deeply aware that our experience would forever cast a shadow over our memories of this place. The vacation that was supposed to be a dream had become a nightmare, and the villa would remain a chilling reminder of the night we faced our deepest fears. The morning after, the terror felt like a dream, a surreal blend of relief and disbelief. The sun shone brightly over the French countryside, casting a golden glow over the villa that had become the backdrop for our nightmare. Despite the day's beauty, a heavy shadow clung to me, a reminder of the horrors we'd faced. Jenna and I sat at the breakfast table, the meal untouched as we sipped our coffee in silence. The tranquility of the villa was deceptive, masking the chaos that had unfolded just hours earlier. Every creak of the old house, every whisper of wind against the windows made me jump. I glanced at the spot where the criminal had stood, his menacing figure still vivid in my mind. The police had come as if summoned by some miracle. They were efficient, professional, and utterly calm, starkly contrasting to the hysteria we'd experienced. They'd taken the criminal away, his face hidden behind a hood as he was led to their vehicle. I'd overheard snippets of their conversation. He was wanted for a series of violent crimes across several countries. It was a chilling realization that this man, a mere shadow in our vacation, was a genuine threat. The villa felt different now. The grand rooms, once so inviting, seemed cold and distant. I couldn't shake the feeling that the walls held onto the fear from the previous night, that the shadows outside were still watching, waiting. I tried to rationalize it, to remind myself that the threat was gone and we were safe. But my mind betrayed me, replaying every horrifying moment like a relentless loop. We decided to leave the villa early, unable to endure another night in a place tainted by fear. Packing our bags felt mechanical, each movement heavy with dread. Jenna's eyes were red from lack of sleep, and I could see the same haunted look on her face that I felt alone. We exchanged glances of mutual understanding, neither of us willing to voice the full extent of our trauma. As we drove away, I stole a last glance at the villa. Now, a silent observer of our departure, the house seemed to fade into the distance, its once majestic presence now a backdrop to our uneasy escape. I wondered about the stories it had witnessed, the secrets it held. Our vacation had turned into a nightmare, and though the criminal was gone, the echoes of that night would linger with us. In the days and weeks that followed, the memory of that night haunted my dreams. The villa symbolized our vulnerability, a stark reminder of how quickly paradise can turn into peril. We tried to move on and find solace in everyday life's normalcy, but the shadow of our experience remained. It had forever altered our sense of security, leaving us wary and unsettled. The villa was supposed to be a peaceful retreat, a place to escape and unwind. Instead, it became a dark chapter in our lives, a lingering shadow that would always be a part of our vacation story.